The world outside my window was a churning canvas of gray. Not the gentle cotton ball clouds of a summer sky, but a thick, wet blanket of slate and charcoal that seemed to press down on the skin of the airplane. I was flying back to Seattle, a routine hop from a tech conference in Anchorage, and the Pacific below was a cold, unforgiving expanse of steel-colored water, flecked with white caps like angry teeth. My name is Paul, and I'm a software engineer. My world is one of logic, of predictable inputs and expected outputs, zeros and ones. Nothing in my life had prepared me for a variable like this. The flight had been uneventful, a low hum of engines and the occasional ding of the fasten seatbelt sign. I was half dozing, my laptop stowed, my mind already on the backlog of emails waiting for me. Then the first jolt hit. It wasn't the familiar dip and sway of turbulence. It was a violent upward slam, as if the plane had been punched from below by a giant fist. Coffee sloshed, a few people yelped, but the captain's voice came over the intercom, a strained but steadying baritone. Folks, we've hit a patch of unexpected severe turbulence. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened. But it wasn't just turbulence. A sound began, low and guttural, a deep vibration that seemed to run through the very bones of the fuselage. And with it came another noise, high and sharp, a screeching that made my fillings ache. It was a sound like 1,000 giant fingernails being dragged across a cosmic chalkboard. It was coming from outside. Panic began to curdle the air. A woman across the aisle started to pray, her rosary beads clicking a frantic rhythm against the plastic tray table. A man in front of me was yelling at a flight attendant, demanding to know what was happening, his voice cracking with fear. I craned my neck to look out the window past the wing that sliced through the soupy fog. I couldn't see anything, just the endless gray. But the scraping sound grew louder, more insistent, moving along the length of the plane. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way in. Then came the impact, a deafening crunch that was less a sound and more a physical blow. The plane shuddered violently, and the overhead compartments burst open, raining down bags and coats. The lights flickered, died, then came back on as the emergency strips along the floor began to glow an eerie green. The scraping stopped, replaced by a deep, groaning tier of stressed metal. I stared, mesmerized with horror, at the wing outside my window. It wasn't just bending under the strain. A jagged fissure was racing along its surface, not from the joint where it met the body, but from the leading edge, as if something had taken a colossal bite out of it. The metal peeled back like tin foil, revealing the intricate honeycomb of its internal structure. This wasn't mechanical failure. We were being torn apart. The captain's voice came back, no longer calm.
"Brace for impact! Brace! Brace!"
The scream of shearing metal was the last thing I heard before the floor dropped out from under me. My stomach launched into my throat. The plane didn't just fall, it was ripped in two. A brutal, instantaneous separation. For a split second, I saw the other half of the fuselage, the cockpit, the first-class cabin, tumble away into the fog, a ghost ship vanishing into the ether. My section, the tail half, began to spin, a sickening, uncontrolled corkscrew descent. The G-forces pressed me into my seat, a crushing weight that made it impossible to breathe, to scream. The world outside was a blurry vortex of gray cloud and dark water. I saw faces frozen in silent screams, objects suspended in zero gravity for a moment before slamming against the ceiling. The roar of the wind was absolute, a physical presence that filled every inch of the cabin, tearing at my clothes, my skin. My seat, ripped from its moorings, was now just a piece of shrapnel in a storm of debris. I felt a sharp, cracking impact against my side, and my vision swam with black spots. The last thing I saw was not the ocean rushing up to meet me, but the dark, looming silhouette of a massive, tree-covered shoreline. Then, only blackness. The logical world of zeros and ones dissolved into a single, terrifying unknown. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a series of painful, disjointed snapshots. The first was the sharp, metallic taste of blood in my mouth. The second was the biting cold, a deep, damp chill that had settled into my bones. The third was the surreal realization that I was looking down, not up. I was still strapped into my airplane seat, but it was wedged high in the branches of a colossal tree, tilted at a nauseating angle. My head throbbed in a hot, rhythmic pulse. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my eyes. I was suspended at least 60, maybe 70 feet in the air, cradled by the thick, moss-covered limbs of a Sitka spruce so enormous its trunk was wider than my car. The forest around me was a cathedral of green and brown giants, their tops disappearing into a low-hanging mist that dripped with a steady, miserable rhythm. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and the faint, sweet odor of decay. I carefully, painfully twisted my neck. Below me, through the gaps in the dense canopy, I saw the beach. And the horror of my situation crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. The wreckage of our plane was scattered across a jagged, rock-strewn shoreline. The tail section was a mangled husk half submerged in the churning surf. Smaller pieces, a section of wing, twisted husks of fuselage luggage, were strewn across the sand like a child's discarded toys. And the bodies. They were everywhere, some still strapped in rows of seats, others thrown clear, lying in unnatural poses on the wet, dark sand. The gray, indifferent waves of the Pacific lapped at them, pulling and pushing with the tide. My stomach heaved, and I fought back a wave of vomit. And then I saw it. It moved with a purpose that was utterly chilling. At first I thought it was a bear, a massive grizzly drawn by the scent of death. But it was no bear. It stood on two legs, hunched but distinctly humanoid, yet its form was impossibly lupine. It was immense, easily over 8 feet tall, covered in a coat of matted, dirty fur the color of ash and charcoal. Long, powerful arms ended in claws that scraped against the rocks. Its head was a wolf's, but twisted with a malevolent intelligence that made my blood run cold. Its yellow eyes scanned the carnage, not with the hunger of a scavenger, but with the cold focus of a collector. This was the Claw-Claw-Ni, though I would not learn its name until much later. To me, in that moment, it was simply it. The Defiler. I watched, frozen in a paralysis of pure terror, as it moved from one body to another. It ignored the limbs, the torsos. Its interest was singular, ritualistic. With a sickening crunch, it would plant a heavy, three-toed foot on a victim's chest, grip the head with its massive claws, and tear it from the spine. It wasn't eating, it was harvesting. After collecting a head, it would retrieve a long, thick vine that looked like a piece of kelp, and, with a deft, practiced motion, thread the head onto it. It was making a necklace, a grotesque, obscene garland of the dead. The sight was so profoundly wrong, so far outside the bounds of any natural or human evil I could comprehend, that my mind threatened to simply shut down. It worked its way up the beach, methodical and unhurried, closer and closer, to the edge of the forest directly below my precarious perch. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to become part of the tree, to cease to exist. The creature passed directly beneath me. I could hear its guttural wet breaths. I could smell it, a rank, musky odor of wet dog, churned earth, and something ancient, like a long unopened tomb. It paused for a moment, its wolf-like head tilting back slightly, its flared nostrils testing the air. Those glowing yellow eyes, devoid of pupil or pity, seemed to sweep the canopy. Did it see me? Did it smell the living among the dead? The seconds stretched into an eternity of silent, screaming dread. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years. Then, with a low grunt, it continued on its way, its horrific necklace of heads dragging and bumping along the rocks behind it. It disappeared into the dense, foggy woods on the far side of the beach, leaving behind a scene of even greater desecration. The silence it left in its wake was heavier, more profound than the roar of the crash. I was alone on an island with the headless dead, and the thing that had made them that way. The monster was gone, but the terror remained, a cold, hard knot in my gut. For how long, I didn't know. I clung to my seat, shaking, suspended between the unforgiving ground and the gray, weeping sky. Survival, however, is a stubborn instinct. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by the pragmatic, terrifying reality of my situation. I had to get down. My side screamed in protest as I unbuckled the seatbelt. I was bruised all over, a deep, aching pain that promised to get worse. I managed to brace myself against the thick trunk of the Sitka spruce. The bark was rough, covered in a slick layer of moss that offered no purchase. My descent was a clumsy, terrifying scramble from one branch to another, a controlled fall more than a climb. Splinters dug into my palms, and my dress shoes, so sensible for a tech conference, were useless. More than once, my foot slipped and I dangled precariously, my heart seizing in my chest before finding a new hold. Finally, my feet touched the soft, damp earth, and my legs buckled, sending me to my knees in the ferns and pine needles. I had made it. The next few hours were a grim blur of activity fueled by adrenaline and fear. I forced myself back to the bone shore. The sight of the bodies was no less horrific up close, their vacant eyes staring at the indifferent sky. I had to disconnect, to turn off the part of my brain that saw them as people, as fathers, mothers, children. They were now resources. A cold, brutal calculation that made me feel sick to my core. I scavenged through the wreckage, my movements frantic. I found a small survival kit in a mangled overhead bin, containing a roll of gauze, antiseptic wipes, and a small, sharp utility knife. Gold. I found 3 unopened bottles of water near the galley and several emergency blankets still in their plastic wrappers. The food was a bust. Just a few scattered bags of airline peanuts, soaked in salt water. Not nearly enough. Then came the hardest part. The part I knew I had to do. I needed fire. Not for warmth, not yet, but for the future. For protection, for signaling, for boiling water. I moved from body to body, my hands shaking, my apologies a choked whisper on the wind. I avoided looking at their faces. I patted down pockets, my fingers brushing against cold, stiff denim and wool. It was in the pocket of a young man, no older than 20, wearing jeans and a faded band t-shirt, that I found it. A heavy, silver Zippo lighter. The small, metallic click as I opened it was the loudest, most hopeful sound I had ever heard. I tucked it away like a sacred relic. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a new fear crept in. Night. The monster, the Cla-Cla-Nay, had been here in the daylight. What would the darkness bring? My rational mind, the programmer part of me, told me a fire was a beacon. It would scream, "I am here," to anything lurking in the shadows. The risk was too great. I retreated from the exposed beach, dragging my meager supplies with me. I found a dense thicket of ferns about 50 yards into the tree line, their broad fronds creating a low, dark canopy. It wasn't a cave, it wasn't a shelter, but it was cover. I crawled inside, pulling the fronds down around me, wrapping myself in one of the thin airline blankets. The cold was immediate and absolute. Lying there in the near total darkness, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of panic through me. The forest, which had seemed majestic from my perch in the tree, was now a living, breathing entity filled with menace. And then I heard it. A sound that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. It was a heavy, rhythmic tread, accompanied by a low, sniffing sound. It was back. I peered through a small gap in the ferns. In the deepening gloom, I could see its hulking silhouette moving along the shoreline, a darker shadow against the dark rocks. It paced back and forth, its head low to the ground as if searching for something it had missed. A lost key? Another head for its collection? The casual, almost proprietary way it patrolled the beach was the most terrifying part. This was its territory. The crash hadn't brought it here. The crash had simply delivered a bounty to its doorstep. I lay there, motionless, for what felt like a lifetime, my breath held tight in my chest, listening to the monster patrol its grisly kingdom. The first rays of a weak, watery sun filtered through the canopy, bringing not warmth, but a clearer view of my desperate situation. The monster was gone, but its presence lingered like a foul odor. I knew I couldn't stay hidden in the ferns forever. I needed a plan. My first act was one of desperate hope. I spent the morning dragging pieces of white fuselage and rocks onto the open beach, arranging them into a massive, unmissable pattern. SOS. The physical labor was grueling. My muscles screamed, my side ached with a deep, throbbing pain. But the work gave me purpose. It was a shield against the creeping despair. As I stood back to survey my handiwork, a crude but clear signal against the dark sand, I felt a flicker of something that resembled optimism. Someone would be looking for us. They had to be. My next priority was water. The 3 bottles I'd scavenged wouldn't last. I pushed deeper into the forest, following the lay of the land, listening for the sound of running water. The woods were dense and ancient, the ground a soft carpet of moss and centuries of fallen needles. After about 20 minutes, my ears picked up a faint gurgling. I pushed through a curtain of hanging moss and found it. A small, clear stream tumbling over smooth gray stones. The water was icy cold and tasted clean. I drank until my stomach ached, then refilled my bottles, the simple act feeling like a monumental victory. But water wouldn't keep me alive. Hunger was a gnawing beast inside me. The few bags of peanuts were long gone. As I made my way back towards the beach, my eyes scanned the undergrowth for anything edible. That's when I saw them. A small bush, tucked away in a patch of sunlight, was covered in clusters of bright, alluring red berries. They looked almost exactly like red currants, shiny and plump, glistening with moisture. My stomach rumbled. The programmer in my head screamed warnings about unknown flora, about poison and alkaloid profiles. But the starving animal that was taking over saw only food. They looked so harmless, so vibrant and full of life in this place of death. I plucked one from its stem. It was firm between my fingers. I hesitated for only a second before popping it into my mouth. The taste was slightly bitter, but not unpleasant. I ate another, then a handful. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small deposit in my bankrupt energy account. An hour later, I was regretting that decision with every fiber of my being. It started with a tremor in my hands, then a wave of nausea that had me doubling over. I stumbled back to my fern hideout just as the first violent cramp seized my abdomen. I was on the ground, retching, bringing up the berries, and what little water I had in my stomach. A fever bloomed behind my eyes, hot and disorienting. My muscles began to twitch and jerk in agonizing spasms. The world swam in and out of focus. I had poisoned myself. The beautiful, tempting fruit was baneberry, deadly, toxic. I lay there in the damp soil, shivering and convulsing through the night, drifting in and out of a delirious state. In my fever dreams, I saw the wolf creature standing over me, its yellow eyes watching with cold amusement as I did its job for it. The realization was more crushing than the fear of the monster itself. I had survived a plane crash. I had hidden from a creature of nightmare. And I was about to die because I couldn't resist a pretty berry. The sheer, pathetic irony of it was the last thought I had before the world went black again. I woke to the miserable sensation of being cold, wet, and alive. The fever had broken, leaving me weak and hollowed out, but the convulsions had stopped. I had survived my own stupidity, a fact that brought more shame than relief. My body had purged the poison, but the experience left a scar on my psyche. This island wasn't just hostile, it was deceptive. It would kill you with its beauty just as readily as with its monsters. The ordeal had taught me a valuable lesson. I needed a reliable, safe source of food. Berries were out. The forest was a minefield of unknown poisons. The ocean, however, was a different story. I made my way back to the shore during what looked like low tide. The waves had receded, exposing a wide stretch of rock pools and kelp beds. Here I found my salvation. Mussels clung to the rocks in thick blue-black clusters. Small crabs scuttled for cover in the crevices. It wasn't a feast, but it was protein. It was survival. I spent an hour prying mussels loose with my utility knife, my hands raw and cold, and managed to trap a few small crabs under a rock. As I worked, I scanned the horizon, a habit now ingrained. To the south, beyond the curve of the bay, a rocky promontory jutted out into the sea, and perched atop it, stark against the gray sky, was a structure. A man-made structure, a lighthouse. Hope, sharp and painful, shot through me. A lighthouse meant civilization. It meant people, rescue, away off this cursed rock. Forgetting my weakness, I gathered my meager catch and began the trek along the treacherous coastline, stumbling over slick, seaweed-covered rocks. It took me the better part of the afternoon. Up close, the lighthouse was not the pristine beacon of my imagination. It was ancient, built from massive, dark stones that were weathered and stained by a century of salt and rain. The ironwork of the lantern room was rusted, and most of the glass was gone. It was clearly abandoned, and had been for a very long time. My heart sank, but I pushed open the heavy, groaning wooden door and stepped inside anyway. The interior was circular, cold, and smelled of damp stone and brine. A spiral staircase, its iron steps flaking with rust, wound its way up the inside wall. But it was the walls themselves that drew my attention. They were covered in strange, primitive carvings, clearly not part of the original construction. I ran my fingers over them. There were depictions of giant, snarling wolves standing on two legs. There were crude etchings of bat-winged creatures swooping from the sky. And everywhere there were spirals, intricate and dizzying, carved into the stone. It was a gallery of nightmares. Driven by a grim curiosity, I climbed the winding stairs to the lantern room at the top. The view was staggering, a panoramic sweep of the storm-tossed ocean and the endless dark forest of the island. But there was no lamp, no lens, no mechanism for a light. Instead, set into the center of the stone floor was a massive bronze disc, about 3 feet in diameter, covered in the same spiral symbols as the walls below. A heavy bronze lever protruded from its center. There was no helm, no wheel. Just this strange, anachronistic device. What was it? Some kind of primitive capstan? A switch? Driven by an impulse I didn't understand, I grabbed the lever with both hands. It wouldn't budge. I set my feet, put my entire body weight into it, my muscles screaming in protest. With a deafening shriek of metal on metal, the lever moved, and the disc began to turn. A low, resonant hum vibrated up through the soles of my shoes, through my bones. The entire tower seemed to shudder. The sound wasn't coming from the lighthouse. It was coming from deep within the earth, a subterranean groan of ancient machinery awakening from a long slumber. I looked out the empty windows in a panic, my heart pounding. What had I done? My eyes fixed on the southern horizon, beyond the tree line. And then I saw it. A thin but distinct column of gray smoke, rising into the misty air from somewhere deep within the island's interior. Someone else was here. Hope and a new, terrible fear warred within me. I wasn't alone. The smoke was a question mark hanging over the forest. Was it friend or foe? A signal from other survivors? Or the source of the island's deep-seated wrongness? Staying put was no longer an option. The lighthouse had given me a direction and a choice. I chose to move. Armed with my utility knife, my water bottles, and a newfound sense of dread, I plunged back into the woods, heading inland towards the smoke. The forest was even denser here, the canopy so thick it blocked out what little light the sun provided. The air was still and heavy. I moved with a predator's caution, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes scanning the shadows. After what felt like hours of pushing through ferns and navigating around fallen giants, I stumbled upon it, a trail. It was narrow and faint, but it was unmistakably a path worn by repeated footfalls. A human path. I followed it, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The trail led me to a clearing, and my blood ran cold. Before me was a village, if you could call it that. It was encircled by a crude but effective palisade of sharpened logs, at least 10 feet high. At the main gate, which was just a narrow opening in the wall, stood 2 figures. They were natives, their skin a dark, weathered bronze covered from head to toe in swirling black tattoos that mimicked the spiral patterns from the lighthouse. But it was the dominant motif that seized my attention. The wolf. Tattoos of snarling wolf heads adorned their chests, and they wore cloaks made from what looked disturbably like gray and black wolf pelts. They held long, stone-tipped spears, and their dark eyes scanned the forest with a flat, hostile gaze. These were not friendly people. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. These people, this lost tribe, they were part of the island's mystery. Did they know about the creature on the beach? Did they worship it? Fear it? I decided against a direct approach. I began to circle the compound, keeping to the dense cover of the undergrowth. On the far side, away from the main gate, I found what I was looking for. A section of the palisade where a log had rotted at the base, creating a small, muddy gap just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Taking a deep breath, I wriggled through the opening, scraping my back on the rough wood. I was in. The village was a collection of low, windowless huts made of wood and mud. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and cooked meat. In the center of the village, a large bonfire roared, its flames casting dancing, demonic shadows on the surrounding huts, the source of the smoke. And around the fire, the tribe was gathered. They were chanting, a low, guttural drone accompanied by the relentless, hypnotic beat of a drum. They swayed and stomped, their movements jerky and ritualistic. They were celebrating, or preparing for something. Then I saw them. In the center of the circle, near the roaring fire, 2 figures were tied to thick wooden posts. Their clothes were tattered and modern. One was a man with sandy hair, his face pale with terror. The other was younger, of Asian descent, his expression a mask of stoic resignation. Survivors. Like me. The man with the sandy hair looked up, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading horror. It was then that I saw the sharpened stakes and long knives laid out on a hide near the fire, and the look of hungry anticipation on the faces of the chanting natives. My stomach turned to ice. This wasn't a celebration. It was a ritual. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the main course was human. The drumbeat quickened, a frantic heartbeat echoing the terror that pulsed through my own veins. The tribe's chanting rose in pitch and volume, a wall of sound that was both hypnotic and horrifying. Several of the larger tribesmen, their bodies gleaming with sweat in the firelight, picked up the long, sharpened knives. They began to advance on the 2 prisoners. The sandy-haired man, who I would later learn was Samuel, or Sam, began to struggle against his bonds, a raw, guttural scream tearing from his throat. They were going for him first. I was frozen, hidden behind a stack of firewood, my mind screaming. What could I do? I had a 3-inch utility knife against 24 armed fanatics. It was suicide. But to watch, to do nothing, was a different kind of death. I braced myself, my hand closing around the cool metal of my knife, preparing for a desperate, hopeless charge. And then, the sky screamed. It was a sound unlike any I had ever heard. A high-pitched, piercing shriek that cut through the chanting like glass. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound that vibrated in my teeth and rattled my skull. Every head in the village, including mine, snapped upwards. Something was descending from the black, starless sky. It wasn't a bird. It was a silhouette of pure nightmare plunging from the darkness like a raptor. As it dropped into the firelight, I saw it clearly. It was a man, but hideously wrong. Its skin was pale and hairless, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Its face was dominated by a lipless mouth filled with needle-like fangs. And sprouting from its back were enormous leathery wings like those of a bat that beat the air with powerful silent strokes. A kamikaze. A demon from the lighthouse walls, made flesh. It hit the village not as a rescuer, but as a predator hitting a feeding ground. It slammed into one of the spear-wielding guards with bone-shattering force, its long, taloned fingers sinking into his flesh. Without pausing, it launched itself back into the air, the screaming tribesmen dangling from its claws, and vanished back into the darkness. Chaos erupted. The ritual was forgotten, the hypnotic trance shattered. The tribes scattered, screaming in terror, some trying to run for their huts, others brandishing their spears uselessly at the sky. Another shriek, and a second creature descended, then a third. It was an attack, a slaughter. They weren't fighting the Tla-Klani. They were 2 different apex predators, and this village was caught in their territorial dispute. This was my chance. The pandemonium was my cover. While the tribesmen were distracted by the winged horrors swooping and tearing through their ranks, I darted from my hiding spot. I ran low and fast, my knife held out in front of me. I reached the posts, my heart hammering. Sam's eyes were wide, a mixture of terror and disbelief. The other captive, the young Asian man named Lee, just watched me with calm, intelligent eyes. "Hold still," I hissed, sawing at the thick, fibrous ropes that bound Sam's wrists. The utility knife was small but sharp. The rope parted. Then I moved to Lee, cutting his bonds with a few frantic slashes. "Come on, now!" I yelled over the din of screams and shrieks. Sam stumbled, his legs weak. Lee was on his feet in an instant, his eyes already scanning for an escape route. He pointed towards the gap in the palisade I had used to get in. There was no time for thanks, no time for introductions. We broke from the circle of firelight and ran, plunging into the shadows at the edge of the village. Behind us, the massacre continued, the shrieks of the kamikaze blending with the death cries of the tribe that had been moments away from sacrificing us. We weren't saved. We had just traded one executioner for another. We scrambled through the gap in the wall and fled into the black, unforgiving sanctuary of the forest. We ran blindly through the forest, the sounds of the slaughter fading behind us. The only light was the weak beam of my flashlight, bouncing erratically as I stumbled over roots and through thorny bushes. We didn't stop until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. We finally collapsed in a small, rock-strewn clearing, gasping for air. "Bloody hell," the sandy-haired man panted, his voice thick with a British accent. Bloody hell, I thought we were done for." He extended a shaky hand. "Samuel? Sam? Thanks, mate. You saved us?" I shook his hand, my own still trembling. "Paul? And that?" I nodded towards our silent companion. "Is Lee." Lee gave a short formal bow, his face still a mask of composure. Sam gestured towards him. "He doesn't speak a word of English. We were in the tail section together. It came down in one piece, more or less. We stumbled out and those savages found us yesterday morning." He shuddered, rubbing the raw marks on his wrists. "They were going to eat us. I swear to God, they were going to eat us." Lee, understanding the gist of the conversation through tone and gestures, pointed back towards the village, then made a flapping motion with his hands, his eyes wide. He then pointed to the sky, a look of profound fear on his face. "Yeah," Sam breathed. "And then those things, what the hell were they?" Before I could answer, a new sound cut through the night. A sharp cry, followed by an answering call. It was human. It was the tribe. And they were coming for us. They hadn't all been killed. "They're coming," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Run." We scrambled to our feet and took off again, a new wave of adrenaline surging through us. We could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind us, their angry shouts getting closer. They knew the forest, and we were just blundering through it. The trees began to thin out, and we found ourselves on a wide, barren plateau of flat rock, ghostly pale under the moonlight. We had nowhere to hide. We sprinted across the open ground, the shouts of the tribesmen echoing behind us. I could hear the whistle of an arrow slicing past my ear. They were closing in. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I yelled out as I plunged into darkness, landing hard on a steep, sandy slope that sent me sliding downwards. I heard Sam and Lee cry out as they tumbled in after me. We had fallen into a sinkhole, a natural pitfall trap hidden on the plateau. We landed in a heap at the bottom, bruised but miraculously unbroken. Above us, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, the faces of the tribesmen appeared at the edge of the hole. They had us. One of them threw down a rope of woven vines and began to descend. a long knife clenched in his teeth. There was nowhere to run. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing we were at the entrance to a cave. "This way!" I yelled, pulling Sam and Lee deeper into the earth. We ran down a sloping tunnel that opened into a cavern of staggering size. It was a vast, subterranean grotto, the ceiling lost in the oppressive darkness above. The air was cold and wet. In the center of the grotto was a massive black lake, its surface as still and glossy as obsidian. The only way across was a narrow, treacherous-looking ledge no more than 2 feet wide that snaked along the cavern wall. We had no choice. I led the way, pressing myself flat against the cold, slimy rock, my flashlight beam pointed at the path ahead. Behind us, the tribesmen entered the grotto, their torchlight painting the cavern in flickering, hellish oranges and reds. As I shuffled along the ledge, my light passed over the surface of the water below. I saw a ripple, then another. The water was teeming with movement. My beam found one of the shapes. It was pale, sightless, and amphibious, with a wide, frog-like head filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. Cave dwellers. And they were hungry. One of the tribesmen, impatient in his pursuit, tried to leap across a wider section of the ledge. His foot slipped on the slick rock. He fell with a strangled cry into the black water. The surface instantly erupted into a churning froth of violence. The water turned red. The man's screams were cut short with a horrifying, wet tearing sound. The other tribesmen froze on the ledge, their torches held high, their faces masks of horror. The momentary distraction was all we needed. We scrambled the rest of the way across the ledge and plunged into another dark tunnel on the far side, leaving our pursuers trapped between us and the horrors in the lake. The tunnel we escaped into was different. It wasn't a natural, winding passage. The walls were smoother, almost carved, and they began to glow with a faint, sickly yellow light. I clicked off my flashlight. The light was coming from thick veins of some kind of crystal embedded in the rock, pulsing with a slow internal luminescence. The walls were no longer bare. They were covered in ancient, detailed carvings. The same spirals from the lighthouse, the same wolves, the same bat creatures. It was a story, told in stone. The glowing corridor sloped gently downwards, opening into a central chamber that stole the breath from my lungs. It was a massive, perfectly circular hall, lit by the same eerie yellow crystals. In the exact center of the chamber stood a colossal altar, carved from a single piece of black stone into the shape of a snarling wolf's head, its mouth open in a silent howl. And at the base of this monstrous idol, arranged in a neat semicircular pattern, was a collection of fresh, human heads. My stomach lurched, the heads from the beach. Some I recognized from the plane. This was it. The creature's den. Its temple. We had stumbled out of the frying pan and into the very heart of the fire. We were standing in the lair of the Claclané. A scraping sound from the tunnel behind us made us spin around. The surviving tribesmen had found another way around the lake. 3 of them, their faces painted with grim determination, burst into the chamber, spears leveled. They saw us, and a triumphant snarl spread across the leader's face. They had us cornered against the great altar. There was no escape. They advanced slowly, savoring the moment. Sam let out a choked sob. Lee stood beside me, his fists clenched, ready to go down fighting. I raised my small utility knife, a pathetic gesture of defiance against the inevitable. Suddenly, a massive form dropped from a ledge high up in the darkness of the ceiling, landing with a ground-shaking thud directly between us and our pursuers. It was the Claclané. The beast was even more terrifying up close. It stood to its full, hulking height, its yellow eyes burning with a cold, ancient intelligence. Its lips curled back to reveal teeth like railroad spikes. A low, guttural growl rumbled in its deep chest, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor. The reaction of the tribesmen was instantaneous and utterly unexpected. They didn't scream or run. They dropped their spears. They fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the stone floor in an act of abject worship. They began to chant, a low, terrified prayer. They weren't hunting the monster. They weren't its enemies. They were its acolytes. It was their god. My mind reeled with the revelation. The beheadings weren't random savagery. They were offerings, sacrifices to this walking nightmare. Lee, his mind working faster than Sam's or mine, grabbed my arm and Sam's with surprising strength. He hissed urgently and gestured downwards, his eyes wide with meaning. He was pulling us to our knees. Pray with them, do what they do. It was a desperate, brilliant gamble. We dropped to the floor, mimicking the posture of the tribesmen, trying to make ourselves small, insignificant, part of the flock. The great beast ignored us. It padded silently towards the 3 prostrate tribesmen. It lowered its massive head and sniffed at the first one, a long, deep inhalation. The man trembled but did not move. Then, with a casual, almost dismissive motion, the Claw-Claw-Nee hooked its claws under the man's chin and, with a single, violent wrench, tore his head from his shoulders. It was not an act of anger but of ritual fulfillment, the god accepting its tribute. It tossed the head towards the pile at the base of the altar and turned its attention to the next worshipper. The 2 remaining tribesmen remained prostrate, paralyzed by a faith so absolute it transcended the instinct for self-preservation. The Claw-Claw-Nee loomed over the second man, its hot, foul breath ruffling his hair. It was about to repeat the grisly ritual, to claim its next offering. The air in the cavern was thick with the coppery scent of blood and a primal, suffocating dread. We were next. Once it was done with its followers, its gaze would surely fall upon the interlopers who had dared to profane its sanctum. Just as its claws began to lower, the high-pitched shriek of a kamikaze echoed from the corridor. A hairless, winged shape shot into the chamber, a streak of pale flesh and leathery wings. It didn't swoop or circle. It flew directly at the Claw-Claw-Nee with suicidal intent. The ancient enemies, depicted on the walls of the lighthouse and the cave, were meeting at last. The werewolf god spun around, letting out a deafening roar of fury as the kamikaze slammed into its chest. The impact sent both creatures staggering back. The battle began without preamble, a whirlwind of tooth, claw, and leathery wing. It was a conflict of raw, brutal power against agile aerial ferocity. The Claw-Claw-Nee swiped with claws that could shear through steel, but the kamikaze was impossibly fast, ducking and weaving, its wings beating to lift it just out of reach. It would dive in, rake at the werewolf's face with its taloned feet, and then shoot back up towards the ceiling before the Claw-Claw-Nee could retaliate. The air filled with the sounds of their fury, the wolf's guttural roars and the bat creature's piercing shrieks. The 2 remaining tribesmen, their god now otherwise occupied, finally broke. They scrambled to their feet and fled back down the corridor from which they came, their faith shattered by the blasphemous assault. In the midst of this titanic struggle, Lee tugged at my sleeve again, his eyes wild. He was pointing. Behind a massive, crystal-encrusted pillar near the wall was a dark opening, a narrow fissure in the rock barely wide enough for a person. A way out. "Go!" I hissed at Sam, shoving him towards it. We crawled on our hands and knees, keeping the chaos of the battle between us and the pillar. The monsters were completely consumed by their ancient hatred, oblivious to our escape. Sam squeezed through the fissure first. Lee followed, pushing me ahead of him. As I began to worm my way into the tight space, the fight reached its crescendo. The kamikaze, feinting a high attack, suddenly dropped low. The Claw-Claw-Knee, expecting another aerial assault, reared up, exposing its thick, muscled neck. It was the opening the bat creature had been waiting for. It lunged forward, its wings folding, and sank its vampiric fangs deep into the werewolf's throat. The Claw-Claw-Knee let out a gargled roar of agony and surprise, clawing frantically at the creature latched onto its neck. The kamikaze held on with grim tenacity, its body thrashing as the werewolf tried to shake it loose. There was a sickening sound, a wet, heavy crack of bone and sinew that echoed through the cavern. The kamikaze ripped its head back, tearing the Claw-Claw-Knee's head clean from its shoulders. The massive, headless body of the wolf god stood for a moment swaying, before crashing to the stone floor with a final earth-shaking thud. Silence descended, broken only by the wet, ragged breathing of the victor. The kamikaze stood over the corpse of its foe, blood dripping from its fanged maw. It raised its head, its black, soulless eyes scanning the chamber. Its gaze fell upon the two petrified tribesmen who had just returned, drawn by the sudden silence. Without a sound, the kamikaze launched itself at them, a silent, winged angel of death. I didn't wait to see the outcome. I scrambled the last few feet into the tunnel, the wind from the creature's wings, and the scrape of its talons on stone just inches from my heels. We had escaped one god, only to leave another, victorious and hungry, in its place. The fissure was tight and claustrophobic, scraping at our clothes and skin as we pushed our way through. It opened up into another smaller cave, this one mercifully empty of monsters or worshippers. The walls here were also carved, but these were different. They weren't just icons. They told a story, a sprawling mural that covered every available surface. My flashlight beam traced the narrative etched in the stone. We saw the Claw-Claw-Knee, not as a singular beast, but as one of many. One carving showed the creature biting a human who then twisted and transformed, becoming a werewolf himself. An army of them. Another section depicted a great war, this army of werewolves clashing with an army of men, armed with spears and torches. The battle was epic, a desperate struggle for dominion. We followed the mural around the cave, trying to see the outcome, but the final panel, the one that would have shown the victor, was gone, the wall having crumbled away into a pile of rubble centuries ago. The island kept its oldest secrets. We found another tunnel leading from the history room, this one sloping steeply upwards. Cool, fresh air, smelling of rain and pine, drifted down to meet us. Hope surged. After a short, arduous climb, we emerged from a crack in a rock face, blinking in the disorienting darkness of the forest night. We were free. We collapsed at the base of the rocks, utterly spent. The adrenaline that had kept us going for hours drained away, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a gnawing hunger. I had lost my scavenged muscles somewhere in the chase. All we had left were the last few sips of water in one of my bottles. We shared it in silence, the three of us bound by the horrors we had witnessed. "So," Sam finally said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "a lost tribe of cannibals, a giant werewolf god and flying vampire things. Anything else this bloody island wants to throw at us?" No one had an answer. The only plan we could form was to get as far away from that cave as possible. The lighthouse, the one symbol of the outside world, was our only goal. We decided to head back towards the coast, back towards my makeshift camp. We moved through the night, a trio of ghosts haunted by the things we'd seen. It was hours later, as we neared the coastline, that we saw it. Through a break in the trees, we could see the distant promontory where the lighthouse stood, and it was lit. A powerful white beam was cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the ocean. "A light!" Sam cried, his voice cracking with relief. "Someone's there! They've relit the lighthouse!" We started to run towards it, renewed by this impossible sign of rescue. But as we got closer, the light faltered. It shone brightly for another 10 seconds, then sputtered and died, plunging the coastline back into absolute darkness. The hope that had flared so brightly was extinguished just as quickly, leaving behind an even deeper gloom. What had happened? Who had lit it, and why had it gone out? We finally stumbled back to my original campsite near the wreckage. There were no answers, only more questions. We were too exhausted to care. I showed them my pathetic shelter in the ferns. Without a word, we huddled together under the thin airline blankets, listening to the ceaseless roar of the waves on the bone shore, and fell into a deep, troubled sleep. It was Sam who woke us. The sun was up, casting long shadows through the trees. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, pointing frantically out to sea, his face a mask of frantic, joyous disbelief. "Look! Paul Lee, look!" I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, and followed his gaze. There, on the horizon, was a ship. It wasn't a trick of the light or a phantom of my imagination. It was real. A sturdy-looking vessel, probably a fishing trawler or a research ship, moving steadily closer to our island. We didn't hesitate. We burst from the cover of the trees, screaming, waving our arms like madmen. Lee, Sam, and I were a chorus of desperate, ragged voices, yelling until we were hoarse. It wasn't enough. We were just 3 specks on a vast shoreline. "The Zippo!" I yelled, fumbling in my pocket for the lighter. "The fire! We need a signal fire!" We worked with a feverish intensity, piling up dry driftwood, pieces of the wreckage, anything that would burn. My hands shook as I flicked the Zippo. The flame caught, small and fragile at first, then growing, latching onto the dry wood. A thick column of black smoke began to pour into the sky, a stark contrast to the gray clouds. We stood there, feeding the fire, waving, screaming, praying. For an agonizing 10 minutes, the ship continued on its course, seemingly oblivious. My heart began to sink, and then we heard it. A long, deep blast from a ship's horn. They had seen us. A small inflatable boat was lowered from its side, a tiny black dot that grew steadily larger as it sped towards the shore. 3 figures were in it. Rescue. Real, unbelievable rescue. As the boat crunched onto the sand, 2 men in rain gear jumped out, their faces grim as they took in the sight of the wreckage, our fire, and our haggard appearances. "Are there any more of you?" one of them asked, his voice steady and professional. "No," I choked out. "Just us. We're the only ones." The journey back to the main ship was a blur. We were wrapped in thick, warm blankets and given hot coffee that scalded my throat. On board, we met the captain, a weary-looking man with kind eyes. "We're a marine research vessel," he explained, as we sat in the warmth of the galley. "The official search and rescue grid for your flight is over 100 miles north of here. No one was looking for you here. This island isn't even on most modern charts." "Then how did you find us?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. The captain sighed, running a hand over his face. Our navigation systems went haywire last night. Some kind of bizarre magnetic interference from the island. We were completely off course. We were about to turn back when we saw it. He looked directly at me. For about 30 seconds, the old lighthouse on the southern point lit up. A bright, powerful beam, like it was brand new. It was impossible. That thing's been derelict for a century. We thought we were seeing things, but it was enough to make us decide to check the island out at first light. By the time we got here, we saw your smoke. I stared at him, the world tilting on its axis. The bronze disc, the lever. My random, desperate act in the lighthouse hadn't brought the monster. It hadn't brought the tribe. It had sent out a single, desperate pulse of light. A signal from a machine I didn't understand, powered by forces I couldn't comprehend. An action I had thought was a mistake had, in the end, been our salvation. As the ship's engines rumbled to life and it began to pull away from the cursed shore, a final sound drifted across the water from the island's dark, forested heart. It was a long, piercing shriek, filled with rage and triumph. The kamikaze, the new king, proclaiming its dominion over its grisly, unchallenged kingdom. I stood at the railing, watching the Isle of the Bone Shore shrink until it was just a dark smudge on the horizon. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my soul that a part of me would never leave. The horror of that place was now a passenger I would carry with me forever.